Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the intricacies of negotiations, accountability, law, and diplomacy in peace processes. Join us as we dive into discussions with individuals who have played key roles as diplomats, lawyers, prosecutors, negotiating peace and justice. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the co-founder and the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. In this interview, I am joined by Dean Michael Scharf, who is also my co-founder of the Public International Law and Policy Group. Mike, welcome to the program.
Paul, it's great to be on your program.
So Michael is the dean of the law school and a chaired professor at Case Western Reserve University. Michael has been a prominent figure in the prosecution of major war criminals, having advised every international criminal tribunal and supported on a pro bono basis the creation of a number of domestic and hybrid tribunals. Michael's extensive scholarship has been ranked as among the most cited in the field of international criminal law since 2010. In today's conversation, we will focus on the origins of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and Michael's key role in supporting its establishment. Now, at the time, Michael and I were both serving in the Office of Legal Advisor at the Department of State. Mike was in the legal office for the UN Affairs Bureau, and I was in the legal office for the European Affairs Bureau. Now, I first met Michael when he popped into my office about 6:30 one evening with two massive slices of pizza. He handed one to me, and he handed a draft Security Council resolution and said, "Paul, we are going to spend the evening together drafting a UN Security Council resolution to impose an arms embargo on the rapidly dissolving Yugoslavia." From that day forward, Michael and I became steadfast friends. And after our time at the Department of State, we embarked on the journey of creating the Public International Law and Policy Group, which, as our listeners know, is an NGO that provides free legal assistance to parties involved in peace negotiations and designing and implementing mechanisms to prosecute atrocity crimes. But today, we're going to focus on Mike's role in creating the Yugoslavia Tribunal and its impact on the trajectory of international criminal law. I do want to note, before we jump into our conversation, that Michael's work in helping to create the Yugoslav Tribunal earned him the Department of State's Meritorious Honor Award in recognition of superb performance and exemplary leadership. Thank you for joining us, Michael. I look forward to speaking with you today.
And Paul, let me just jump in with one correction to my bio. I know you and I have been doing this a long time, but when you said I've been involved with every international criminal tribunal, I really wasn't around for Nuremberg, but you're right about the rest.
All right, Michael, well, you're not that old. You've only got a tad bit of gray in that head of yours. Well, Michael, can you take us back to the time when you were an attorney advisor at the Department of State and walk us through the initial US approach to criminal accountability for atrocity crimes?
So really, the approach started with Nuremberg. And after Nuremberg, a lot of countries thought there would be a permanent international criminal tribunal. But the United States and some of the other major players were very afraid of the crime of aggression, which they prosecuted the Germans for at Nuremberg. They thought that it might be used against them, especially during the Cold War. So the US was very much against any international criminal tribunal. Then in about 1989, some Caribbean states had the idea of having an international drug tribunal. And there was a lot of interest in that at the United Nations. And there was a resolution that the United States supported to try to make that go away by sending it to the International Law Commission for years and years of study. Unfortunately for the United States, it went a little bit faster than the US thought. And there was a draft that came out about a year later. Well, when all of that was happening, the US was still in this theory of how are we going to kill this idea of an international criminal tribunal when genocide came back to Europe for the first time since World War II. And suddenly, events on the ground changed politics pretty quickly, both at the UN and in the United States. The US was under a great deal of pressure to do something when there were all these videos on TV of people that looked like Holocaust victims, but this time the victims of the Serb concentration camps in Bosnia. And suddenly things began to shift, and there was interest in doing something for accountability. That's where I found myself at the State Department.
Well, Michael, can you walk us through in a little more depth those conversations that were happening at the State Department and at the UN early on? Both the policy conversations, but also the legal conversations about creating a Yugoslavia tribunal.
Well, the next step was to document the atrocities. And of course, every resolution that was drafted by the United States, I was involved in as attorney advisor for UN affairs, and you were involved in as attorney advisor for European affairs because this dealt with a European crisis. So the two of us and our team drafted first a resolution that would document the atrocities. And it basically just said that any country that had any documentation, any evidence of atrocities, should collate it and send it into the UN. But nothing was happening with that. That was just a first step. The next step was the creation of a war crimes investigation. And this commission was quite controversial. Some wanted to call it a committee and give it no powers. Others wanted to call it a commission and give it great powers. And in the end, it was called the 780 Commission because that was the Security Council that created it. And there again, there were lots of problems because they didn't fund the commission. And so the commission, which ended up being chaired by Sharif Bassioni, a law professor from DePaul University, it went out and got voluntary funds. And it used the university and partner law firms to secure the information that was coming in. And then there was a question of, well, what would the commission do? And everybody at the time thought it would just do a little research paper, like a law review article, but that's not what it did. It ended up doing a very serious study of the atrocities, and then it recommended that an international tribunal be created in the model of Nuremberg. And so the next step was, well, who was going to control the creation of this tribunal? How was it going to be created? And there were various proposals floating around the world about this. Some wanted it to be created by a treaty. Some wanted it to be created by the UN General Assembly. The US finally agreed with a French proposal for it to be created by the UN Security Council. And the French proposal had a two-part process. Part one was the resolution just said, let's establish a tribunal and let's ask the UN Office of Legal Affairs to come up with the draft statute, and let's have the OLA, the Office of Legal Affairs, get models or proposals from any country interested in sending them one. And then step two will be, once the statute is ready, they would approve the statute and then launch the tribunal.
So, Michael, when they were launching this tribunal, when they were having the debate in the Security Council, what were they thinking about? What were they worried about? What was on the minds? Or there's just, look, we have to do something. Let's create a tribunal and get back to, other areas of interest around the globe.
If you think back to this time, it was so shocking, these revelations of atrocities in Europe, that everybody agreed something had to happen. But I think most people wanted it to just be a Band-Aid, a symbolic action, just something that looked good for the press. No one really thought that the leaders were eventually going to be prosecuted by this tribunal. They just wanted to get a tribunal up and running. Maybe the indictments would have some symbolic value. And nobody was interested in giving it a great deal of funding or a great deal of power. It wasn't going to have a constabulary to go around arresting people. So it was mostly going to be a symbolic effort to just show that the international community was not ignoring allegations of genocide.
So, Michael, let me dive into that a little bit and link it up to peace negotiations, since the title of this podcast is Lawyering Peace. When you were there with the diplomats, the ambassadors, thinking through the creation of the tribunal, and you had a long trajectory before that of, thinking about and engaging in scholarship on international criminal law. So you had a pretty good perspective on where this might lead. But did anyone consider that this tribunal might indict Ratko Mladic and Radovan Karadzic, the chief military officer of the Republic of Srpska, and the self-declared president of the Republic of Srpska before the Dayton negotiations, and thereby exclude them from the negotiations, or that the tribunal might indict Slobodan Milosevic, a sitting head of state, for atrocity crimes in the former Yugoslavia. Was this on anyone's mind?
It was a different time period back then. It really was called the age of impunity. And now maybe we're in the era of accountability. But at that time, if you remember, there were a number of peace processes where people were traded peace for the agreement to give them an amnesty or immunity from prosecution. And so, the first big one was South Africa. They had this Truth Commission. They gave everybody amnesty. They did not prosecute the crime of apartheid. But the same thing happened about this time period involving the Haitians, who had committed all kinds of atrocities when General Cedras overthrew Aristide. And instead of prosecuting him, they gave them asylum in another country. And this was the pattern throughout the world. If anybody was thinking about the peace process and justice, what they were thinking of is, we might be able to get peace by trading justice. That's our tool to get to yes.
All right, so create a tribunal and then use it to threaten, but then trade off the amnesty for peace. Well, Michael, let's dive into that a little bit. Justice Richard Goldstone, who had been involved in the Constitutional Court for South Africa and played a key role in the transition out of apartheid. He was selected as the first prosecutor for the Yugoslav Tribunal and then subsequently the Rwanda Tribunal. What were some of the challenges that he faced in terms of setting up the tribunal, but also in terms of navigating a transition, ideally, from an era of amnesty to an era of accountability?
So, one of the things about creating international institutions is they take on a life of their own. You hire good people for that, and they decide to do a serious job. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the diplomats who had some other idea for the tribunal were going to share the same vision. So, I wrote this book about the time the tribunal was created called Balkan Justice. And I spent a lot of time interviewing Richard Goldstone for the book. What I learned was Richard Goldstone basically said, I don't care about politics. I don't care about diplomacy. I have a job to do. I was given the responsibility to find out who has committed crimes, follow the evidence trail, develop indictments, and prosecute everybody who deserves to be prosecuted, and international politics be damned. And that was his approach. But at the same time, he also said, listen, I only can prosecute war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. They did not give me the authority to prosecute the crime of aggression. And Slobodan Milosevic, at the early days of Richard Goldstone's work, only seemed responsible for launching a war of aggression. And so Richard said, I'm probably not going to prosecute Slobodan Milosevic because I'm focusing on the crimes within my jurisdiction.
Richard Goldstone was assertive, aggressive, committed to pursuing justice. Did this take our friends in the State Department by surprise, or other governments by surprise? And did they cooperate with him in providing information, intelligence, resources? How did the global community react to this highly assertive and highly competent prosecutor?
Well, not very well, actually, Paul. So Richard had his hands tied because they underfunded him, they under-resourced him, and they wouldn't give him any police cooperation, including at this time, NATO had peacekeeping forces in the former Yugoslavia, in Bosnia, and some of the people that Richard was indicting, and the indictments would be circulated, they would go through NATO checkpoints, and the NATO officers would just smile and wave. So he was getting absolutely no cooperation from the international community. They, were bound and determined to make sure that the tribunal was mostly symbolic. And it made his job incredibly difficult in the early years.
So, Michael, let's turn to a little bit more of a personal story. So after you and I had left the Department of State and had created the Public International Law and Policy Group, You reached out to Richard and offered to provide pro bono legal assistance. Given that he wasn't getting a lot of international assistance, you reached out and said, hey, would you like a global pro bono law firm to provide some assistance on these legal issues that you're dealing with? And you also invited him to co-chair PILPG's advisory board along with Ambassador Morton Abramowitz. Walk us through, how does that happen?
Well, so I had these conversations with Richard during the writing of the book. He was very candid about how he had so little resources in terms of money and personnel. And he said, what I really could use is an army of outside lawyers who would give us pro bono service, who would do a deep dive on some of these very complicated legal issues that haven't been prosecuted in 50 years and help us out with that. And so we entered into an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, and together PILPG and my students were assigned to work on a number of really difficult legal issues. And we would send them. Back then, we didn't just send them a flash drive or push a button and send it electronically. We FedEx them these big notebooks full of not just the memo, but every resource that was cited in the memo, so that he would have a library of things for him and his prosecutors to pull from when they were writing their briefs. And when I went visited the Yugoslavia Tribunal in his offices in the library, there was an entire shelf full of the PILPG memos. It was very gratifying to see. And some of those memos, you could see the language was making its way into the briefs that were being submitted to the tribunal. Now, we didn't ask him to chair the advisory committee while he was prosecutor. That happened years later, but we had created this relationship with him. And then, he became the prosecutor also of the new Rwanda tribunal. So he had us do work for the Rwanda tribunal for the genocide that occurred there. And then the special court for Sierra Leone was created. And David Crane, the prosecutor there, said, hey, I heard you're doing work for my buddy Richard. I'd like you to do the same kind of work for me. And we did it for that tribunal, the Lebanon tribunal, the Cambodia tribunal. And as you said, ultimately, we've been doing this kind of work for every tribunal.
So, Michael, let me take you back to your book on Balkan justice. And, that was the first trial since Nuremberg. It was the first war crimes tribunal. Many commentators indicated that Duško Tadić was a weekend war criminal. He was a local police officer who would go, some of his friends were running the local concentration camp, and he would go on the weekends and then go back to his job as a police officer. When Duško Tadić was indicted and when the trial was launched, did this give comfort to some of the diplomats who started to think, well, we don't really have to worry about this tribunal interfering with the peace process because they're just going to go after low-level war criminals? Alternatively, was it criticized for basically pinprick accountability? There was a huge controversy with occasional light touch airstrikes to support the UN peacekeepers, and they were called pinprick airstrikes that weren't having any impact. And then here again, it looked like we were having pinprick justice that wasn't going to have any impact on the peace process. Can you walk us through that time in the 90s and what people thought about this trial and why it was important at the end of the day?
So, Paul, the story was even worse than how you described it. They didn't just indict him because he looked like somebody who was indictable. He ended up leaving Bosnia because his little town had an economic decline, and he goes to Germany. And while he's in Germany, people who also had been refugees from the Bosnia conflict literally saw him and said, that's Duško Tadić. That's the guy that tortured me, that beat me, that raped my friends. He's a bad guy. And something should happen about that. So the German authorities ended up taking him into custody, and they were going to prosecute him. And it would have been fine. They would have done a nice prosecution. They had the witnesses there and everything. But Richard Goldstone was pretty desperate for a win. He'd been there for a couple of years. He was getting paid a lot of money. The judges were getting paid a lot of money. Nothing was happening. So under the tribunal statute, it was created by the Security Council, and it had something called primacy, which is different than the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which has complementarity. Under primacy, if they decide they want to prosecute somebody who's being prosecuted somewhere else, even if the other prosecution would just be fine, they can reach out and ask for a deferral. And so that's what they did. And Germany was happy to send Duško Tadić to The Hague. He became the first prisoner in the new Hague prison. Big, giant prison up on the beach, empty, except for Duško Tadić. And so they bring this case to trial. Early on, there were all these rumors that Duško Tadić was a really, really heinous guy. He beat people up, but he was there when there was a killing spree. And in the end, they were able to prosecute him for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, wearing a camouflage uniform and a gun and being a thug. And that is not what they were intending to do to prove, the crimes of the former Yugoslavia. But one of the interesting things is it was the first trial. And Richard Goldstone, being very savvy, he starts out with these historians, and they had to prove the context for these crimes. And they basically put the context of the war on trial. It was almost like a truth commission. And so that in that way, they did get a conviction, and they did get evidence of the history of the conflict and what happened there in this first trial. But at that point, it was still like, why are we spending $100 million on this international tribunal for one thug? There were a lot of questions about this tribunal. And that's about where the things started to change and the politics started to change. It could have been a disaster. It could have gone down in history as just a joke. But, things did change. Milosevic, well, I guess to start with Karadzic and Mladic, they didn't want those guys at Dayton. And it was very convenient for them to have them be indicted right before the Dayton peace accords, and then have the peace negotiators and Slobodan Milosevic say, sorry, guys, we can't have you at the peace negotiations because you're under indictment. And so that's, I think, where things started to change. And you were very much involved in the Dayton peace negotiations. So, the story from the other end, but I know it from talking to Richard that he saw this as a moment to take advantage of, and he did.
Yeah, so Michael, I wanted to drill down a little bit on the indictment of Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic. Richard Holbrooke, the U.S. diplomat, Carl Bildt, the EU diplomat, in the spring and summer of 1995, were engaged in shuttle diplomacy, trying to tee things up for the Dayton negotiations. They hadn't yet decided where they were going to hold them, but they wanted to basically engage in this shuttle diplomacy. And then, boom, all of a sudden, Richard Goldstone, the Yugoslavia prosecutor, comes out and indicts Karadzic and Mladic. Now, you'd indicated that there's actually a little bit of a relief because they didn't want them at the Dayton Accords. But did this send shockwaves? We had Duško Tadić, weekend war criminal. People kind of took their eyes off the tribunal. Then, as you said, Goldstone used the trial to set the historical context, to build momentum, to prove various crimes, and then came out with this indictment of the two most senior leaders of the Republika Srpska engaged in the conflict in Bosnia. What was the reaction? Shock and awe, shock and surprise?
Well, right before the indictments come out, you see a lot of videos on the news, first of Karadzic, who is the president of the Bosnian Serbs, basically saying, we need to kill all the Bosnian Muslims to cleanse our land of them. And so he was saying genocidal things, and I don't think anybody was that surprised that there was an indictment of him. Ratko Mladic, who was originally a Yugoslav National Army general, but he's then given on loan to the Bosnian army. And he was the general in charge of all of that. He was the guy that later at Srebrenica, there's a video of him giving orders to his troops, telling them to kill all the men of the town of Srebrenica. Now, Srebrenica had not yet happened at this point, but there were other videos because this guy was a thug that liked to be videotaped. And so I don't think the world was surprised when those two guys suddenly were indicted. They were sort of the image of what was wrong with this conflict. And if anybody was going to be prosecuted, it was those two. The surprise, Paul, is to fast forward what happened to Slobodan Milosevic.
Well, we'll get to Slobodan Milosevic. I want to dive in a little bit more, a couple more questions on the Dayton Accords. So the indictment of Karadzic and Mladic essentially excluded them from coming to the United States and participating in the Dayton negotiations. Do you think this contributed to peace? Did this indictment actually contribute to the successful negotiation of the Dayton Accords and the subsequent peace in Bosnia, or did it make it more difficult?
No, I think that in one way it made it easier because first of all, Karadzic was a true believer and he was an extreme radical. And Mladic was a military commander that was ruthless. And to have them at the negotiating table would have been, awkward and inconvenient. But I think Karadzic would have just thrown bombs during the peace negotiations and would have held things up, and it would have been very difficult. So if the peace negotiators' goal is to get to yes, at that time they saw Slobodan Milosevic as a more moderate and reasonable partner in peace negotiations. And if Milosevic could say, I'm going to represent the interests of Karadzic and the Bosnian Serbs, so you don't need them at the table, I'll take care of it. I think the peace negotiators thought that that was going to make things easier. Dayton wasn't easy anyway. If you remember, and I know you do, but your folks watching this, the only way that we got to yes at Dayton is because ultimately the United States said, we're going to start bombing the Serbs to the Stone Age if you don't negotiate in good faith. And we even said to the Muslims at the table, we're going to stop supporting you if you don't negotiate in good faith. So, as a mediator, the United States was putting a tremendous amount of pressure to get a peace deal signed.
So, Mike, the peace deal was signed, and there were 50,000 NATO troops deployed to Bosnia, and there was a constitution attached to the agreement. Bosnia is at peace at the moment, has been for the last few decades, but highly dysfunctional governance system based upon a lot of the demands of Milosevic and Tudjman and Krajisnik, who was the representative of the Republic of Srpska. There are four signatories to the Dayton Accord: Milosevic, Tudjman, Krajisnik, and Izbegovic, President Izbegovic from Bosnia. Three of the four of those signatories were subsequently indicted or indictable for crimes that he committed before Dayton. So Milosevic was indicted and tried. He died during the trial. Krajisnik was indicted, and Tudjman died shortly afterwards. But prosecutor Carla Del Ponte had said, I was just about to indict him. The world should know that. But now that he's passed away, I can't do that. We ended up getting to yes with war criminals. What does this tell us about the legitimacy of the Dayton Accords, and what should we think and how should we feel about this?
Well, I don't think that any of the leaders that negotiated Dayton thought that they were going to be indicted. And I don't know, if it was just convenient after they passed away, the prosecutor says, oh, I was about to indict them, because those indictments did not occur during their lifetime. But, part of this history is that people at peace negotiations say, I want amnesty. And there was originally an amnesty in the Lomé Accords dealing with Sierra Leone. And then when they created the special court for Sierra Leone, they basically ignored it and said that only applies to domestic cases. It doesn't apply to an international tribunal. That was a surprise at the time. So I think actually for the peace negotiating parties, they would have been surprised if they thought that they were going to be indicted. And they, I'm sure, would not have cooperated in peace negotiations if they thought that was a possibility.
Okay. So this tribunal hangs over as a potential destabilizing factor for a peace process, but at the same time can remove some of the spoilers or the more hardline actors. Well, Michael, let's take you further down the journey a few years. So a few years after the Dayton Accords, there were the Rambouillet negotiations, and an eerily similar cast of characters and situation, in the sense that the two co-chairs of the Serbian delegation, Milutinovic and Shinovic, they too were subsequently indicted for atrocity crimes that they had committed. But what had changed in that period of time? You had the Yugoslav Tribunal was created. It played a role at the Dayton negotiations. There were different prosecutor, different judges, different chief judge at the time of Rambouillet. How did the role of justice in the peace process evolve?
All right. So at the time of Rambouillet, now you've got Madeleine Albright as the Secretary of State. And she is still thinking of Slobodan Milosevic as the best partner in peace. And what happens is when he starts attacking the Kosovar Albanians and starts committing ethnic cleansing there, she realizes that this had been a mistake, that he was not a reliable partner, that he is now an obstacle, just like Karadzic and Mladic were. And the way that the United States got the prosecutor at the time to indict Milosevic, who I think that they really had been signaling through a variety of means, not cooperating by giving evidence, by saying, look, we need him at the peace table, that they didn't want him indicted. And then once Madeline decides that he is the problem, not the solution, they start what sometimes is called Madeline's War, which is the 86-day bombing campaign to try to get the Serbs to give autonomy and remove their forces from Kosovo. And then ultimately, she sends David Sheffer, the ambassador at large for war crimes issues, and Michael Newton, a colleague of ours, carrying a whole lot of evidence to The Hague to give it to them. And it's phone intercepts, it's satellite imagery, it's all the stuff that the prosecutor had been asking for years in order to prosecute Slobodan Milosevic. And finally, they had it. And what's just to tell us a little story about this, at the same time that that was going on, the prosecutor at the time, this is not Richard Goldstone anymore, it was a former professor from Osgood Hall Law School. And her colleagues, her professor colleagues, had sent a memo to her saying, you should indict NATO because they are committing war crimes in the former Yugoslavia, in Kosovo. They're dropping bombs on Serbia. These bombs are hitting the Chinese embassy. They're using depleted uranium weapons. They're dropping bombs from 6 miles high where they couldn't possibly hit the targets. And so they're killing a lot of civilians. And so she's actually seriously considering indicting NATO. And then this box of stuff comes from Dave Sheffer and Mike Newton. And now she's got the case against Slobodan Milosevic. And she's weighing it like, who do I indict? NATO? Milosevic? Both of them? Neither of them? And I think that had she indicted the NATO leaders, this could have destroyed NATO. It was at a time when NATO was not fully being supported. There was a lot of concern that they had no business being involved in the former Yugoslavia, and a lot of the countries didn't want to continue that. If there had been an international indictment, that would have had a huge diplomatic effect. If she hadn't invited Slobodan Milosevic, I think that Milosevic would have continued the ethnic cleansing. And in the end, she gets this evidence, she gets the green light, she indicts Milosevic, and he knows the jig is up. And so he ends up agreeing, to everything that the international community wanted, including a peacekeeping force, autonomy for Kosovo. And then ultimately he falls from power, and then he finds himself at The Hague, which was the biggest surprise of all.
Yeah, to have a former head of state indicted as a head of state and then a former head of state transferred by Serbia. The new government in Serbia arranged for his transfer to The Hague. Well, Michael, let's unpack a little bit some of the various perceptions that you have of the prosecutors over time. You've known on a very familiar basis all of the prosecutors that had been at the tribunal. What did they think about their role in the peace process and their impact on the peace process? You mentioned that Richard Goldstone was quite clear. Damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead. My job is to prosecute those who are responsible for the atrocity crimes. Was that a consistent worldview across all of the different prosecutors, or were some of them more timid and tardy when it came to impacting the peace process for their indictments, or not?
Well, I think Richard set the tone for the rest, and he could have gone a different direction. He basically said this is a non-political position. And that was kind of dangerous too. I mean, the truth is international tribunals, their politics play a role. They need cooperation. They need the support. They need financial support. They need military support. And he was taking a big risk on it. But after that, I think each of the other prosecutors saw that they were getting more support, both financially and militarily. In the end, the biggest surprise is not just that Karadzic and Mladic and Slobodan Milosevic were all prosecuted by the tribunal, but that over 150 other people were also prosecuted by the tribunal, and that the tribunal had a very high rate of conviction. But here's the other thing that is happening in the background. The people who created the tribunal, myself, you, the others, we thought that the tribunal was going to aid in peace and reconciliation. And in one respect, we've talked about it does help with peace by removing some of the perpetrators who are the obstacles to peace. But in another respect, we were wrong, because we thought that the tribunal would tell the story of the atrocities and would discredit the leaders. And that's not what happens at these trials. And the prosecutors started to realize this, and they didn't care because of the role that they had. So they said, it is not our role to tell history. It's not our role to try to organize our trials to have the biggest impact on people's views of the atrocities. We're just going to get a conviction. That's what our job is. And so as a result, there were opinion polls taken in Serbia. And just like after World War II, there were opinion polls in Germany. The Germans didn't believe Hermann Goering and the other Nazis were actually guilty. They thought it was an unfair court. So too did the Serbs. The tribunal was not changing opinions. It was not aiding a peace process or reconciliation. It was not making neighbors who had hurt each other decide that now they could be friends because somebody was a fall guy and was prosecuted at a tribunal. That didn't happen. And as you said a few minutes ago, Paul, the peace is really tenuous there. And it's going to be maybe generations before people can forgive each other. And I wouldn't say that the tribunal has facilitated that kind of reconciliation. I think that tribunals in generally, because the story that's told is the prosecutor on one side, the defense on the other, and they both get their day in court, it wedges populations rather than brings them together.
Which is interesting because we start out with the tribunal is just going to follow the evidence, going to indict those responsible, isn't going to worry about the political process. But then on the flip side, they're solely focused on following the evidence and indicting those that they're able to indict and prosecute, and aren't actually focused either on the reconciliation or the durability of peace. So in a sense, a double-edged sword or a two-sided coin. How would you characterize the role of the tribunal, the impact of the tribunal in the peace in the Balkans, Bosnia, Kosovo, Croatia, Serbia?
I mean, it's a mixed bag, as I was saying, but this is all experiments in international justice, pilot projects. And every time they launch a new tribunal, they're learning from the past. The next tribunal that was launched was David Crane, the prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone. He took a lot of resources into trying to educate the population of Sierra Leone into what it was that they were accomplishing. And they spent time with creating videos, and they would go around the country and do lectures. And just recently there was a 20th anniversary, and they had literally thousands of people coming and being involved and understanding what was going on. When to fast forward to the Cambodia tribunal, they decided that it was not a good idea to have a small courtroom and have everybody watch it on TV because people in Cambodia don't have TVs. So they created the biggest courtroom ever in the world. 1,000 people could watch these trials that were done, and it was almost like going to a play or something. And they filled that courtroom every day. It's a big glass wall, and then you're watching through the fishbowl the trial unfold. And so I think one of the lessons was you've got to think about the population's perception. Peace isn't just something that's signed at a table. Peace is something that has to take hold. You have to have the people in the country willing to work with each other again, or it's just going to be a pause in the next cycle of violence. And I think that is one of the lessons, but it's a lesson that's not fully understood yet. And one of the things I believe is that documentaries aren't the best way to explain international justice. What's even better are Hollywood-style movies. And one of the ironic things about Germany is, I mentioned earlier, the German people didn't believe the Nuremberg trial was fair. But 30 years later, there was this best-selling movie that was made in the United States called The Holocaust. And it was also a bestseller in Germany. Everybody went to that. It was like Jane Seymour was in it, like all these A-listed actors. And they did polls after that. And what the people in Germany think they know about the Holocaust is not from Nuremberg. It's not from history books. It's from the movie. And the way we know this is that the movie didn't get it quite right because it's fictionalized, but at least it told a story that was positive and would help the German people understand what had occurred and why they needed to take a different path. And I'm a believer that that kind of thing needs to happen after every war, after every tribunal is established. There's got to be ways to get in the social media in the movies, the population to understand, what went wrong. As George Santayana says, if we don't remember the mistakes of the past, we're just going to be repeating them over and over again. And the tribunals themselves are a start, but they're not a finish in getting the population to understand the mistakes of the past.
Because of the very nature of a tribunal pursuing a court case, essentially, it's less publicly accessible than other forms of media, even if they're slightly fictionalized. Okay, Michael, a couple more questions while I have you on the line. Many commentators, including myself, and I want to take you back to the very first question that we chatted about. Many commentators argue that with the momentum of the Yugoslavia Tribunal, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Lebanon, Cambodia, the International Criminal Court, that we have moved out of the era of amnesty. We're now in the era of accountability, and it's not possible to actually go back to the bad old days of amnesty-based peace. Do you agree?
I do think that is probably where we are. Now, the thing about history is that it takes unexpected turns. But, the latest thing that showed the evidence of what you're saying is that the International Criminal Court indicted Russian President Vladimir Putin. And if they wanted to negotiate an end to the Ukraine crisis with Putin, you don't indict him. But I think the feeling was that he was never going to be a reliable peace partner, and that it was better for the international community to galvanize support for Ukraine and for the sanctions and to isolate Putin, make him a prisoner in his own country by indicting him. And that was a big gamble. And we don't know how it's going to end up, because I think most people would say as long as Putin is in charge of Russia, there isn't going to be a useful peace for Ukraine, and the war will go on and on. And so that only gives two alternatives. Either Putin is removed, or you give him some kind of a deal where they drop the indictment. And I agree with you. I think it'd be extraordinarily difficult at this point, with all the cases of all the leaders that have been indicted and all the statements by the international community, that we don't trade justice for peace anymore, to go back on.
Well, Michael, in the course of our time together on this conversation, we've gone from discussing Dusko Tadic, indicted by the Yugoslavia Tribunal, a weekend war criminal, so to speak, all the way through to the arc of the International Criminal Court indicting the president of a permanent member of the Security Council. What role do you think the Yugoslavia Tribunal, again, reminding our listeners that you were there early on, working late at night on the statute and then on the rules of procedure and evidence, bringing the tribunal into being. What role did that tribunal actually play in the arc of international justice and the creation of a global criminal court?
I think Nuremberg was the first. That was the pilot project. That should have been built upon, but the Cold War descended and it stopped it for 50 years. The constellation of stars lined up because you had the Soviet Union collapse. China at the time wasn't as strong as it is. The genocide had returned to Europe, and that enabled the international community to create a tribunal. And again, it was just another pilot project. Nobody knew whether it was going to be a lasting tribunal. It would lead to an international criminal court. I suppose, the fact that genocide occurred just a year later in Africa, and the prime minister designate, who had been a Tutsi, one of the group who had been slaughtered in that genocide, came to the Security Council and literally said, and this is a paraphrase, but it's pretty close, "Is it because we are Africans that you do not create a tribunal for us, but you created one for the Serbs and Bosnians in Yugoslavia and Europe?" And the Security Council was basically unmasked as Eurocentric, as racist, and they had to do something. And ultimately, the Security Council is a political institution, and worldwide opinion affects it. So they expanded the Yugoslavia Tribunal to also be the Rwanda Tribunal, with Richard Goldstone having the prosecutor's position on both tribunals. And then shortly after that, you've got a proliferation of these ad hoc tribunals, all modeled on the Yugoslavia Tribunal. Not possible if it wasn't for that. And then the world got tired of all these little ad hoc tribunals. It was hard. You had to have a whole new tribunal, location, money. You had to get a political process to get the prosecutors and the judges. So they said, let's do the International Criminal Court. And so ultimately, there are now 124 countries that are party to that, way more than I think the United States ever thought was going to support that court. And while the United States support has gone back and forth, the Obama administration supported it, the Trump administration opposed it, Biden is back and supporting it again. It's growing in its credibility. And it felt strong enough, as you said, to indict the leader of one of the world's largest superpowers. And that was very ballsy of this court. It showed that it's no longer a fledgling. It's now moved on. And, we'll have to watch how this results. It could be that this is the thing that leads to the court's credibility. It escalates it. It could be that this is what erodes the court's credibility and it ends up ending the court as an institution. So, we're in a place in history where things are very dynamic. And I'm glad that prosecutors are moving forward, pushing it forward. And I know that the peace negotiators are also really challenged with the things that are going on right now. But just to get back to your question, it all started with the Yugoslavia Tribunal as the first modern international tribunal. And all the rest look an awful lot like that tribunal as well. The experiment that was done there, they have improved upon, but the basics are the same.
So, Michael, one last question. You've had over 30 years of promoting international accountability for atrocity crimes, and in all of the places you've worked on promoting accountability, there's been a peace process in parallel to that accountability. What is the one takeaway that you want our listeners to learn and remember about the interplay between justice and peace?
I mean, I think in the end, what I have realized is that peace negotiators want to get to yes. And sometimes that only leads to a temporary peace. We've seen this in a lot of places. If you want a lasting peace, you have to have accountability. And not only prosecutions, but you have to work to make sure that the historic record is accepted by the community. They have to believe that, at least not if everybody was prosecuted, at least there were some symbolic prosecutions, or they're going to take justice into their own hands and there's going to be another cycle of violence. And so it makes it harder for the peace negotiators when you have to deal with the accountability issue. They want to trade justice for peace, but in the end, that's a mistake. And I think that's the lesson of the last 30 years.
Well, Michael, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to have a conversation with me and for the benefit of our listeners. It's always such a fun and energizing conversation when you and I talk about these issues. You've been at so many pivotal points in the history of accountability over the last 3 decades. And I personally am excited to see what you continue to do in this field in the next 3 decades.
Well, it's been a privilege to be able to have some of that impact. And it's also a privilege to be on your podcast. So thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you, Michael.